Hello, everyone. Welcome to an exciting day here at To Be Like Christ. We're starting a new Bible study. That's why it's exciting. We're starting First Kings. We did First Chronicles. Now we're coming back to First Kings because of the chronological order, basically. Picking up at the very end of the life of King David. Now, if this is your first time, you've just come to study First Kings with us, know that we've covered all the previous books of the Bible, Genesis through 2 Samuel, and there are PDF outlines going over all the key information of those chapters, and there's also video studies, and all that is for free on our YouTube channel and on our website at tobelikechrist.com. So if you're just jumping in for First Kings, know that there's a lot of backstory to this, and what we've covered in the initial books of the Bible kind of lead up to this story. And so if you're confused about characters or anybody, you can go back and reference some of those old studies. So for those of you who are new, let me just give a quick rundown of what we do in every one of our Bible studies. We try to cover the key information, and I'm reading off exactly what you're seeing on the screen, so you're sharing my information with me. The key stuff that we try to talk about is when the events happen. We try to place them on the timeline of biblical and world history. We talk about the key characters, or some people don't like that I use the word character because it sounds fictional, but I mean that in the sense of like these are historical individuals who we're going to be talking about who are key to the story, to the Bible narrative. And then we talk about where the events happen. So that's why we got that big old map on here geographically. Where exactly did these events play out? And then an outline where we try to break the chapter down into the key sections, basically, so we can get an idea of what it's talking about and the key themes that run through the chapter. And then finally, we have an application, which is, for us, 21st century or whatever century you're watching this video in. For us, in the modern day, what do we do with this chapter? How can we take an application away from this to apply into our lives? And so that's a bit of an introduction. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We try to do it in roughly 5 minutes. We run a minute or two over every once in a while. And the first video of any book is always longer because of all the introduction stuff. So now let's finally get into our outline. Talk about the book of First Kings. It said that originally First Kings and Second Kings were actually one book, but because of the way that books were written and scrolls and codex and things, they were eventually split into two. But really, it's kind of a continuing story. Let's talk about 1 Kings chapter 1. When, on the timeline of history, did these events happen? Well, in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles, we talked all about the reign of King David, and he reigned for about 40 years. We're getting to the very end of his reign at this point, so we're in roughly 1015 BC. And just to clarify, if you go out online, you look at other people's Bible timelines, they're going to probably shift the dates of David's reign, maybe 40 years one way, 40 years another way. There's a lot of debate even amongst Bible historians and archaeologists about when exactly David, Solomon, Saul reigned. And so you will see differing dates, but it's pretty clear that it was around this time period. Now let's talk about our key historical characters. We've got David. He's the second king over all of Israel and Judah. You remember who the first king was? Saul. Right? And then David took over. And then we have Solomon, who's going to take over for David. Solomon was David's son with his wife Bathsheba, and he eventually became the third king over all of Israel and Judah. And we have Adonijah. Adonijah was another one of David's sons, David's fourth son. He tried to claim the throne for himself. We'll see how that works out in this chapter. The text describes him as a very handsome man. I think this is at least the second son of David who's described as being very handsome. So he must have had some good genetics going on. And then we have our last individual, Abishag. Abishag is a young woman who's described as being very beautiful. She assists David in his old age. That's what we'll talk about in the first 4 verses of this chapter. Now, as we look at our map, we're finally seeing the city of Jerusalem kind of coming of age, and it's going to be extremely significant in the life of Israel, Judah, the Jews moving forward for hundreds and hundreds of years. So kind of the main location of the kings is Jerusalem. It was the capital where David's house was, where Solomon would reign from. We're also going to talk about a place called Enrogel. Now, Enrogel was the place where Adonijah's allies met to try to appoint him king. You won't see it on the map, and the reason is because, well, there's not enough room. Enrogel was actually very close to Jerusalem, no more than a mile to the south of Jerusalem, so right around that area. Find Jerusalem, you'll know roughly where Enrogel was. Now, there's a place we're going to talk about that's even closer to Jerusalem than Enrogel, and that is Gihon. This is where David had Solomon anointed king. This is on the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so now we know about our timeline, we know about our historical characters, we know about our map. Now let's move over to the outline and talk about the actual meat of chapter 1. What is this chapter about? Well, I've got 1, 2, 3, I think 5 sections here. The first one is going to be verses 1 through 4. A young woman is found to help David stay warm. So as I mentioned, David's getting pretty old. The text says at this point that he's, quote, old and advanced in years, and he was having trouble staying warm. We have like central heating and better heating systems, but back then, winter came around, you're really old, you probably have some trouble. Well, his servants decided to find a young woman to help him stay warm. Now, this sounds pretty weird to us, but apparently what I was reading is that this was actually done quite often in ancient days. You'd find somebody younger whose body heat was higher to actually come and basically be a personal heater for somebody, especially royalty and people of privilege. They found a young woman named Abishag to do this job. She stayed with the king and she served him, but the text does tell us that he knew her not, which is basically the Bible's way of saying that this was a relationship based around heat. It was not a sexual relationship. So here we kind of have an introduction to this young woman named Abishag. She's going to come up in the next chapter and be important there. So we're going to leave her for now, but we'll talk about her in chapter 2. Let's now talk about a guy named Adonijah, who we mentioned was David's son. Adonijah tries to make himself king, verses 5 through 10. Adonijah, who was David's son with a woman named Haggith, decided to declare himself king in his father's old age. He thought, well, the throne's about to be up for grabs. I'm going to go ahead and preemptively declare myself to be the king and take advantage of this opportunity. He actually managed to get several of David's really important allies on his side, including Joab and Abiathar, the priest. However, he failed or neglected or just didn't want to counsel with some of David's other closest allies, including Zadok the priest, Benaiah, who was in charge of David's bodyguard, Nathan the prophet, Solomon, and David's mighty men, which were David's elite fighting force. Adonijah, David's other sons, and the officials of Judah went to this place called Enrogel, just south of Jerusalem. They offered sacrifices and they honored Adonijah as the next king. Now in the next section, verses 11 through 27, we see Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba trying to protect Solomon's throne. So when Nathan the prophet learned of Adonijah's intentions to make himself king, he went to Bathsheba to inform her. Now why Bathsheba? It's because she's Solomon's mother. Bathsheba's Solomon's mother. So he goes to Solomon's mother. He says, hey, look, Adonijah's trying to take the throne that your son is supposed to inherit. Let's do something about this. He knew that he needed to act quickly if they were going to counter Adonijah. And so they made a plan to go to King David and to talk to him. Nathan and Bathsheba went to David and they informed him of Adonijah's actions and they encouraged him to make it clear to the people who his chosen heir was supposed to be. Evidently, there was some ambiguity or wasn't quite clear. In some way, they went to David and said, look, make it clear. We know that your intention is to put Solomon on the throne. Make that clear to everybody right now, or it's going to be too late. What we see in verses 28 through 40 is that David acts on this. Solomon is anointed king. David commanded Nathan, Zadok, and Benaiah to take Solomon, to put him on the king's mule, which evidently was recognizable. Everyone would see Solomon going out on the king's mule, that he had the king's favor. Take Solomon, take him to a place called Gihon. They took him to that place, and they anointed him king there in the presence of all of the people. Remember, Gihon was just to the east of Jerusalem, so it wasn't a super far journey. The people all celebrated, quote, so that the earth was split by their noise. And so they were happy that this was taking place. All the people recognized, great multitudes of people recognized that Solomon was going to take over David's throne. Solomon was then brought back to Jerusalem, and he was actually put onto David's throne, just to make it clear. Now, evidently, Adonijah hadn't anticipated that things were going to go this way, because in verses 41 through 53, we see Adonijah asking for Solomon's mercy. When Adonijah's company heard the news and learned that Solomon had been anointed at Gihon, they were terrified, and all of his allies dispersed. They disbanded. Adonijah was so afraid of Solomon that he went probably to the tabernacle, to the altar that was there, the altar of burnt offering. The text says that he took hold of the horns of the altar, and he wouldn't leave the altar until he got a promise from Solomon that Solomon wasn't going to kill him. Well, Solomon gave him that promise. He said he wouldn't do him any harm if Adonijah would prove himself to be a worthy man. So after he received that reassurance, Adonijah left the altar and he went and he paid homage to King Solomon. So we see 1 Kings chapter 1 starting off with this jockeying for position or taking the throne. This is pretty quickly decided when Solomon is put in place and Adonijah essentially relinquishes his claim and falls at the mercy of Solomon. Now for our application, I don't want to talk about the politics and the big events happening on the throne of Israel. I actually want to go back to Abishag, talk about something we can learn from her. Serving the elderly is godly work, even if it's not always glamorous work. And we should admire people who care for the aging. It's hard work, and it's often thankless. And do you think Abishag really wanted this job? I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe it was an honor. But do you think, a young, beautiful woman really wants the job of just being like a heater for a old, sickly man? I'm going to guess probably not. But she did it, and she served faithfully, and that's admirable. We should be willing to serve older people when we have the opportunity or when we have the responsibility. God actually commanded respect to the elderly in his law to the Israelites. In Leviticus 19, verse 32, quote, "You shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord." So Abishag's service to David was commendable, and she sets an example that's worth mimicking. I got a new appreciation for that when my brother and I took it was like a prerequisite for a nursing program. It's basically like a hospital aid or like a health aid. And part of it was that you had to go to a nursing home and basically do like caretaker functions, like help people clean and shower. And, these are like people in a nursing home, right? And it's very humbling work. It's hard work, and it's certainly not glamorous work. And I got a new appreciation for that. So that probably spurred today's application. So I definitely want to say thank you to the people who do that kind of stuff.